Today we will explore the brutal and frequently forgotten reality of medieval battles, demystifying the heroic narratives that movies and books have presented to us for decades. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this. There is an open field somewhere in Europe. The year could be any between the 11th and 15th centuries. The sun has not yet fully risen, but hundreds of men are already on their feet, organized in irregular ranks, breathing heavily while they await what is to come. Some mutter prayers, others check their weapons for the 10th time, and there are those who simply stare at the horizon, trying not to think about what will happen in the coming hours. None of them carry the confident expression that historical portraits suggest. None of them seem ready for glory. They look exactly like what they are. Ordinary men, many of them peasants summoned in haste, about to face something that no training could truly prepare them for. The night before was long for most of these soldiers. Many slept in the open, in improvised tents or simply wrapped in their cloaks on the cold and damp earth. Sleep, when it came, was interrupted by nightmares or by anxiety that made the heart race for no apparent reason. Some vomited from nervousness even before dawn. Others sought comfort in prayer, making promises to saints and swearing to return to their families. Hunger was constant, as food in medieval campaigns was scarce and frequently spoiled. Clean water was a luxury that few could hope for. These conditions, combined with the fear of what was to come, transformed the men into shadows of themselves, even before the first sword was unsheathed. When the armies begin to form, the first indication of what would be the true chaos of medieval war arises. Trumpets and horns sound somewhere in the distance, but their commands are frequently drowned out by shouts, by confusion, and by the constant noise of horses and clinking equipment. The common soldier, especially one who had never participated in combat before, could barely understand what was happening around him. Orders were shouted, repeated, distorted as they passed from mouth to mouth. The infantry tried to organize into compact blocks, with shields joined, while archers positioned themselves on the flanks or behind stakes driven into the ground for protection. The heavy cavalry, mounted on their powerful war horses, awaited the signal for the charge. The man responsible for the sounding of the horn that would signal the start of combat generally found himself in a safe position, well away from the front line. It was an intelligent choice on his part. Medieval war musicians had one of the highest life expectancies in the armies of the time, second only to the kings and nobles who initiated the conflicts and rarely exposed themselves to the real risks of combat. The first 15 seconds of a battle were frequently more dangerous than any subsequent moment, not because of the enemies, but because of the confusion among the combatants themselves. Almost half of the men on the front line tripped over their own feet or over the companions beside them. Medieval battlefields were not flat and organized terrains like those we see in artistic representations. They were muddy fields, full of hidden roots, loose stones, and irregularities in the ground that waited only for the right moment to bring down a warrior in full charge. There was nothing grand about falling face first on the ground while trying to look threatening. It was humiliating, dangerous, and absolutely common. The heroic charge that movies portray never happened in the way we imagine. The soldiers did not advance in an epic run against the enemy. They dragged themselves in a nervous mass, with weak knees after hours of standing in formation under the sun or the cold. The man beside them breathed heavily, exhaling an odor of garlic and fear. Foul breaths were a universal characteristic of medieval armies, as oral hygiene was practically non-existent. Perhaps this is the reason why soldiers shouted so much during combat. It was the only way to breathe without smelling the lunch of their battle companions. Everyone shouted, but few could explain exactly what they were saying. Most simply screamed to drown out their own terror. Modern studies on combat demonstrate that approximately 70% of men in war situations emit involuntary sounds that they do not remember afterward. If it were possible to translate most medieval war cries, they would probably sound like desperate pleas for help or late regrets for having arrived there. Then came the first impact. Someone crashed against the soldier's shield with enough force to make his ears ring. It was impossible to know if the sound came from the blow or from the man who had just delivered an accidental headbutt. The noise was deafening, but not in the epic way that soundtracks suggest. It was a wall of grunts, screams, and the sound of metal hitting metal or flesh. The warrior's arm vibrated so much after blocking a blow that he felt as if this vibration would be transmitted to all future generations of his family. After 2 minutes of combat, any grand battle plan was reduced to a single simple objective: staying on one's feet. Falling meant death, not necessarily by the enemy, but by the weight of other men trampling over the fallen body. The ground quickly became slippery with blood and vomit. Arms ached from holding the shield up. The sun punished the combatants inside their padded armor. Medieval armor was like an extremely uncomfortable portable sauna, the only weight loss program of the time, where one could lose several kilos in sweat or one's own head, whichever came first. Each combatant's world was reduced to the few meters around him. All he could see were the terrified eyes of the man in front of him, who was as confused as he himself was. In that moment, both silently agreed that whoever told them the battle would be glorious deserved a special place in the depths of hell. And all this was just the beginning. If the soldier survived the initial shock, he would face the next brutal reality of combat. Real medieval combat looked much more like a violent shoving match than an elegant fencing duel. Fighters did not face each other one-on-one. They attacked in groups whenever possible. 5 against 1 was considered good strategy, not a lack of sportsmanship. Knights did not follow a code of honor during the battle. They followed the code of wanting to return home alive, which surpassed any other consideration. The pressure of the bodies made it practically impossible to use proper sword techniques. The space to move the weapon was only a few centimeters. It was impossible to execute those large, dramatic sword arcs when one was shoulder to shoulder with other soldiers. Most sword fights involved pushing the blade forward in an awkward way, like someone trying to poke another passenger in a crowded subway car. Swords were rarely responsible for the fatal blow anyway. Analyses of battlefield graves reveal that most mortal wounds came from downward blows to the top of the skull or the neck. Exactly what would happen when someone fell and others piled on top of him. Medieval battle strategy was less about defeating the opponent with honor and more about kicking him when he was down, then kicking again, and maybe once more just to be sure. The pommel of the sword, that heavy piece of metal at the end of the handle, frequently proved more useful than the blade itself. Weapons experts call this the half-sword technique or the murder stroke, where the combatant held the blade and swung the handle like a hammer. This technique was called the death blow, probably the most honest name for any fighting move in history. There were no euphemisms, just the raw description of its purpose. Helmets saved lives, but they created new problems. They limited vision to a narrow slit and transformed the user's head into a metal oven under the sun. After only 20 minutes of combat, the temperature inside a medieval helmet could exceed 40 degrees. Many combatants died not from wounds, but from thermal exhaustion. Medieval knights basically fought inside portable saunas while people tried to kill them, which made them either the bravest or the most reckless humans in history. If a combatant fell during this chaos, he had about 2 seconds to get up. Not because of some rule, but because that was the time necessary for boots to start trampling him, or for weapons to find the gaps in his armor. Examinations of medieval battle sites show that many bodies were found face down in just a few centimeters of mud. These were not dramatic deaths, just slow suffocation after the fall. There was nothing glorious about it. No heroic last words, just the silent darkness of mud filling nostrils and mouths. Wounds frequently came from unexpected angles. Armor could stop a sword coming from the front, but what about the man attacking from behind or the side? A typical combatant received attacks from at least 3 different directions within any 1-minute period. His head spun trying to track all the threats, which was ironic, since keeping his head literally in place was the primary goal. The crushing, the trampling, and the disorientation took more lives than actual combat skills. Medieval brutality resided not only in intentional violence, but in the absolute indifference of the battlefield toward individual life. Each man was just one more body in the chaotic mass, and his survival depended as much on luck as on any skill he might have developed. If by some miracle the soldier survived this chaotic pile, with all limbs still in place, his next challenge would be dealing with the weapons flying in his direction. The weapons of medieval battles were not the shiny pieces we see in museum exhibits. Most were composed of crude tools designed for a single purpose: to breach anything that stood between the attacker and the enemy's vulnerable parts. Starting with battle axes, they were not elaborate. They were basically the same tool used to chop wood, only modified to cut through shields, armor, and, unfortunately, human bones. They had a great advantage. Not much training was needed to use them effectively. It was enough to swing with force, aim approximately at the target, and physics did the rest. The disadvantage was that once the axe bit into something, be it a wooden shield or someone's rib cage, it frequently got stuck. Discoveries in medieval battlefields show that many axe-bearers died while trying to wrench their weapons free. An axe stuck in the enemy was frustrating and potentially fatal. Spears were the most common weapons on medieval battlefields, with some armies using them for up to 70% of their forces. Why such prevalence? They were cheap to produce and required minimal training. A simple wooden shaft with a metal tip could be mass-produced easily, even by smaller kingdoms with limited resources. The real benefit was the reach. It was possible to poke someone almost 2 meters away while that someone was still trying to get close enough to attack. The disadvantage was the lack of maneuverability. In tight formations, spears became more of a danger than a help. Maces solved a problem that swords could not solve: plate armor. As metal armor improved, slashing blows became useless against it. The solution was to stop cutting and start crushing. A mace was essentially a heavy metal ball on a shaft, designed to dent the armor inward, breaking bones without needing to cut the metal. Simple, effective, and terrifying. Ecclesiastical records of the period show that many religious knights preferred maces because technically they did not shed blood and therefore did not violate religious restrictions. Medieval logic in its purest form, it was not permitted to cut the enemy, but it was perfectly acceptable to turn their internal organs into paste. Apparently, the heavens had no objections to that. Swords receive all the glory in stories, but in truth they were the least common weapons on medieval battlefields. The reason was simple. They were expensive. Extremely expensive. A good sword could cost as much as a small house. They required special steel, skilled craftsmen, and years of training to be used effectively. Only nobles and professional soldiers typically carried them. And contrary to cinematic magic, swords broke frequently. Analyses of swords from battlefields show that many had been repaired multiple times before their final use. Nothing ruined a heroic moment more than the elegant sword snapping in half at the first blow. Then there were the improvised weapons, the desperate solutions of peasant armies and last resort fighters. Agricultural tools adapted for war were remarkably common. Flails for threshing grain, pitchforks, and even sharpened shovels appeared regularly on medieval battlefields. Records from several major battles indicate that up to 20% of common soldiers fought with modified agricultural equipment. These improvised weapons frequently proved surprisingly effective, mainly because no one expected to be defeated by a gardening tool. Death by shovel was not glorious, but it was as final as death by sword. The quality of weapons varied enormously as well. While kings and nobles wielded masterfully crafted pieces, most common soldiers used mass-produced weapons of questionable quality. Rust, loose handles, and improperly tempered metal were commonplace problems. Many weapons failed during use, leaving their owners running in search of alternatives. It was not uncommon to see men abandoning their defective weapons and picking up anything they found on the ground, including stones, pieces of wood, or the weapons of nearby corpses. As these crude weapons found their targets, medieval combatants quickly learned that armor did not make them invincible, only slower when trying to escape. And the wounds that these brutal tools left behind opened the doors to a new level of horror on the battlefield. All those weapons described previously were not designed to look impressive. They were designed to tear human bodies apart. And tear they did. Armor helped, but not as much as one might think. Chainmail could stop a slashing sword once, maybe twice, but a direct blow from an axe or mace made the mail fold directly into the flesh, transforming the protection into part of the wound. Records from battlefield surgeons indicate that about 40% of knight casualties had broken bones despite their armor being intact. Armor was basically medieval bubble wrap. It could take the first fall, but anything after that was just the sound of crushing. A blow to the shoulder could take the entire arm with it. Medieval weapons did not make clean cuts. They ripped, hacked, and mutilated. Most combatants who lost limbs in battle did not die from the wound itself, but from the blood loss or the infection that followed. Blood loss happened much faster than in movies, where heroes continue fighting despite multiple wounds. The human body contains approximately 5 liters of blood, and losing less than 1 liter can cause unconsciousness. Records suggest that many soldiers bled to death in less than 5 minutes after serious injuries. Sometimes the combatant didn't even realize he had been hit until his vision blurred and his knees gave way. Internal injuries caused by blunt weapons were actually worse than cuts. There was nothing to suture, only pain and panic. A solid mace blow might not break the skin, but it could rupture organs, crack ribs, or cause brain bleeding. Medieval doctors had a technical term for these hidden injuries, something that could be translated as the "he was fine a minute ago" syndrome. The soldier walked, talked, even smiled, and then simply collapsed, dead from wounds that no one could see from the outside. Not every injury was dramatic. Teeth flew when helmets received blows. Eyes were pierced by splinters from broken shields. Small wounds that today would only need a few stitches became mortal threats due to infection. Records from monastery hospitals show that for every soldier who died in battle, 3 others died later from infections in their wounds. The mathematics of medieval death was merciless. Surviving combat was only half the equation. There were no doctors waiting on the sidelines of the field. The closest thing to field medicine was other soldiers tying belts around wounded limbs to slow the bleeding or cauterizing wounds with heated dagger tips. Medieval pain scales went from "I can still fight" to "please kill me now," with very little space between one and the other. Agony was accepted as an inevitable part of the experience, and any relief was considered an extraordinary luxury. Field hospitals, when they existed, were generally just tents where the wounded were laid on straw. Surgical instruments were not sterilized. With luck, they were wiped with a cloth before use. Success rates for field surgeries hovered around 30%, and most procedures involved amputation, not because it was always necessary, but because it was fast. In an environment where dozens of men awaited care with terrible wounds, speed surpassed precision. An amputated arm meant the surgeon could move on to the next patient. The brutality of the solution reflected the circumstances. The mental trauma of these injuries frequently proved as devastating as the physical damage. Many survivors described feeling their minds fragment during the battle, especially after witnessing or suffering horrific injuries. The concept of war trauma did not exist in medieval terminology, but its manifestations were documented in accounts of nightmares and erratic behavior in veterans. And as the battle continued, the combatant's mind began to play tricks. The medieval battlefield was not just a test of physical strength, it was a mental nightmare for which few were prepared. As the battle unfolded, something strange happened to the minds of the combatants, something that training could not prevent and that bravery could not overcome. The question, "Where am I?" haunted many fighters after only 10 minutes of combat. The constant movement, the spinning to face threats from all sides, and the lack of clear lines of sight meant that many soldiers quickly lost their sense of direction. Without modern communication systems, units separated and became disorganized. Studies of battle accounts reveal that approximately 60% of medieval soldiers could not identify which direction they were looking after the initial shock. This explains why some battles ended with both sides accidentally retreating from each other. The deadliest game of "you go first" that humanity ever invented. The question, "Is this man with me or against me?" became almost impossible to answer once combat truly began. Although armies frequently used identifying colors or symbols, these quickly became covered in mud, blood, and dust. In the panic of battle, soldiers sometimes struck down their own allies by mistake. Records from the Battaglia de Towton in 1461 show that up to 1 in 10 casualties may have come from friendly forces, with hundreds or thousands of combatants spinning through the battlefield. Split-second decisions frequently had mortal consequences. A familiar face seen in a glimpse could be friend or foe, and there was no time to verify. The question, "Is this blood mine?" represented a terrifying moment that arose when the combatant noticed he was covered in blood, but could not tell if it was his enemies, or his friends. Blood splatters from nearby deaths could cover a man from head to toe, making it impossible to know if he was wounded without stopping to check. Time he did not have when someone was trying to crush his head. Many combatants described the surreal experience of being drenched in blood and yet unharmed, while others did not notice serious wounds until they felt dizzy from blood loss. The question, "Do I attack now or just keep dodging?" transformed combat decisions into something almost automatic as the battle proceeded. The conscious mind could not process information fast enough to make considered choices. Instead, combatants relied on muscle memory and instinct. Training exercises repeated many times took control, like a choreography that the body remembers even when the mind is absent. Those who survived battles frequently reported having no memory of specific actions they took. Their bodies fought while their minds went elsewhere. It was like driving home and suddenly realizing you don't remember the last 10 minutes of the trip, except that instead of missing a turn, the soldier might have eliminated 7 people without any conscious memory. The human brain simply was not designed to handle the stress of medieval combat. Fear, anger, and confusion took turns controlling behavior, with little room for strategic thought. Modern studies on how the brain processes extreme stress show that higher cognitive functions shut down under threat, leaving only the most basic survival instincts active. For medieval combatants, this meant that their carefully planned battle tactics frequently gave way to primitive responses in a matter of minutes. All the training, all the preparation, all the strategy dissolved at the first real impact. The warrior began to attack shapes instead of people. As exhaustion and stress increased, vision could narrow to a tunnel. Instead of seeing whole people, combatants began to react only to movement and basic shapes. A flash of metal, a blur of color, something coming from the left. Friend or foe became irrelevant in this state. If something moved toward him, he attacked. Records of medieval battle survivors consistently mention this strange detachment, where other humans stopped looking human and became just threats or obstacles. After enough minutes of this sensory overload, the body moved on its own while thoughts became just white noise. Modern combat psychologists call this battle mind, a state where action precedes conscious thought. In this altered state, combatants reported feeling disconnected from their bodies, as if observing themselves fight from a distance. Time stretched or compressed, with some soldiers remembering minutes of combat that witnesses said lasted hours, or hours that passed in what seemed like moments. This mental disorientation made the battle even more chaotic than it already was. And when everything became too much to bear, many chose the only option that really made sense. History books glorify last stands. Movies show heroic soldiers fighting to the death. The reality was that most medieval soldiers had a more sensible approach. When things got bad, they ran. Battlefield records show that about 40% of medieval armies fled before combat reached its peak. This was not seen as shameful by common soldiers. Shame came from the nobles and knights with reputations to protect. Peasant combatants followed the principle of wanting to see their families again. Medieval infantrymen had a saying that could be translated as, "The graveyard is full of heroes, but the tavern is full of runners." Battles frequently ended because one side panicked first. Once a few people started running, it created a chain reaction. The Battaglia de Hastings featured several moments where Saxon forces broke, fled, regrouped, and returned before the final outcome. Indecision and fear were forces as powerful as any sword. Many combatants pretended to be dead, simulated wounds, or begged for mercy when cornered. Some hid behind horses or wagons. A French soldier survived by crawling inside a dead horse and remaining there for hours. It definitely was not the kind of heroic story someone would tell their grandchildren. Survival surpassed dignity in practically every circumstance. Fleeing had its own dangers. Companions could strike down the deserter, and in heavy armor running any distance was exhausting. Many knights were captured simply because they ran out of breath after 100 meters. The irony of being caught not for a lack of combat skill, but for a lack of breath did not escape anyone. The armors that protected men during combat became prisons when they decided to flee. Those who managed to escape successfully frequently discovered that victory was not about glory. It was something much simpler than that. When we think of victory in war movies, We see soldiers celebrating, flags waving, and heroic speeches. The medieval reality was much less worthy of a visual record. If the soldier was still standing when the dust settled, congratulations. He had won. That was practically the only criterion for victory. No elaborate ceremony, no medal, just the deep relief of not being dead yet. It was basically the deadliest game of musical chairs in the world. When the music stopped, whoever was still standing won the prize of continuing to exist. No dramatic celebration erupted when battles ended. Most survivors were too exhausted, wounded, or traumatized to celebrate. Battlefields after combat were strangely silent places, with combatants simply sitting where they were, too depleted to speak. The typical victory celebration was not a triumphant shout, but something more like, "Thank God it's over, does anyone have water?" and maybe a new pair of pants that isn't stained with someone else's blood. The period immediately after focused on practical matters. The soldier wiped blood from his face, hopefully not his own, and checked for wounds he hadn't noticed. He looked for his friends and collected usable weapons from the ground. Medieval post-battle checklists were simple: arms still in place, legs working, friends with some missing, enemies with even more missing. The field became a somber market after the battle. Valuable armor was stripped from the dead, regardless of which side they had fought for. Even boots were taken from corpses if they looked better than one's own. Medieval recycling was efficient. Nothing was wasted, especially if it was shiny or still had a good edge. The soldier celebrated by drinking any available alcohol to numb both physical and mental pain. An English chronicler observed after a major battle that the men drank for 3 days without stopping, as if trying to drown what they had seen in mugs of beer. Medieval victory parties were less about singing triumphant songs and more about trying to forget everything through alcohol. Alcohol was medicine and therapy in a single mug. The medical tents were crowded with the wounded. Field hospitals had mortality rates between 25 and 50%. Medieval hospital waiting rooms had only 2 categories: might live and probably won't. One's category depended largely on whether the surgeon had slept enough the night before. The physical aftermath lasted for days. Bruises appeared where the combatant did not remember being hit. Sleep came with difficulty, interrupted by sudden movements to block attacks that were not there. There was nothing that said, "successful warrior," like punching the air during sleep. And somewhere in the mud, a broken helmet remained crooked on a stake. Medieval battlefields were rarely cleaned. They simply grew over with vegetation, with occasional pieces of metal working their way to the surface centuries later. What movies call victory was really just the beginning of a different kind of struggle, one waged not against enemies, but against pain, loss, and the knowledge of what humans were capable of doing to each other when ordered. The survivors carried invisible marks for the rest of their lives. Recurring nightmares, exaggerated reactions to sudden sounds, inability to speak about what they had witnessed. The glorification of medieval war that we find in romances and movies completely ignores these lasting consequences. For every night celebrated in ballads, there were dozens of common men who returned home broken in ways that no medieval healer could fix. The truth about medieval battles challenges practically everything that popular culture has taught us. There was no epic music, only screams and the sickening sound of metal meeting flesh. There were no elegant duels, only desperate shoving in masses of bodies. There were no invincible heroes, only terrified men trying to survive the next few seconds. And there were no glorious victories, only the exhausted relief of still breathing when it all ended. Medieval battlefields were places of absolute chaos, where strategic plans dissolved in minutes, and where survival depended as much on luck as on any skill. They were places where armor could cook a man alive, where friends sometimes killed friends in the confusion, and where the only certainty was the uncertainty of each following moment. The next time someone watches a cinematic representation of a medieval battle, perhaps they will remember that the reality was infinitely dirtier and more terrifying than any screenwriter would dare to show. The men who survived these experiences were not heroes in the romantic sense of the word. They were survivors, carrying visible and invisible scars from experiences they would have preferred never to have lived. Medieval history is full of battles that shaped the destiny of nations, determined lines of succession, and redrew borders. But behind each of these battles were thousands of individual stories of fear, pain, and despair that rarely find their way into history books. The truth about medieval war is not a narrative of glory and honor. It is a narrative of survival against terrible odds, of humanity tested to its limits, and of wounds that lasted long after the last sword stroke. The echoes of these battles still resonate through the centuries, not in the triumphant songs that troubadours composed, but in the broken bones found in archaeological excavations and in the fragmented accounts of traumatized survivors. Medieval war, in all its unromanticized brutality, offers us an uncomfortable mirror of our own nature, reminding us of what we are capable of when civilization is set aside and only the instinct for survival remains. If you have made it this far and learned something new about the true face of medieval war, it shows that you are someone who values history as it really was, not as we would like it to have been. Just as medieval soldiers depended on their companions to survive on the battlefield, this channel depends on people like you to continue bringing documentary narratives that reveal the truths hidden behind historical myths. Subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any new documentary. Leave your like as a sign that you survived this journey through the medieval battlefield, and in the comments, tell us which aspect of medieval war surprised you the most. Your participation is what motivates us to continue unearthing the stories that official history preferred to forget. Until the next documentary, where we will continue exploring together the most fascinating and unexplored corners of the human past.